What do you need to be loved? Is it rich, successful, young and beautiful, or maybe kind and selfless, brave and strong, funny and resilient? What kind of person deserves to be loved? If we take a look at media we women grew up watching and reading, their answer seems to be that to be loved we must be good girls. If we are exceptionally virtuous and kind, life will reward us and people will adore us. We might even win over our tormentors, we might tame scary monsters, we might stop wars before they even begin, all with the power of our innate goodness. And then the world will be saved with our grace, kindness, and compassion. But here's a trope that has completely overtaken the market of female-oriented web novels and comics in Korea and Japan. A girl or young woman dies and gets reborn as a character in a piece of media she consumed before her death, usually a game or a novel. Yet she reincarnates not as the heroine of the story, but as a side character, or most often the villainess, whose fate is, well, to die a horrible death, basically. Or another popular genre trope is the villainess regression story. A bad, selfish girl dies a horrible death of a villainess, and then, miraculously, travels several years back in time and is given another chance at surviving. Details may vary, but the most important elements of the tropes are a female protagonist who is branded as a villainess and for some reason knows what's going to happen to her, and usually it's nothing good, and she is determined to change her fate. And the setting is usually fantasy Europe or something that looks like 1800s. So basically we have a female character in a very restrictive and patriarchal society who is hated by everyone around her, has no real power or allies, and is destined to die because she's been reborn as a character that, according to society, doesn't deserve love. She's been reborn as a bad girl. And the very society that she finds herself in is structured in a way that renders her powerless, and usually at mercy of men. These stories are notorious for being sometimes excessively cruel to the villains, who have to fight not only against the extremely restrictive aristocratic societies, but also against their own abusive families, who make things even worse for them. Sounds like a masochistic kind of story, right? Yet it's so popular. A notable statistic from a manga search reveals 365 titles specifically categorized under Akuyaku Reijo on Manga Okoku, and I found more than 400 manga and webtoon titles tagged as Villainess on Analyst alone. And at the heart of these stories are bad girls, the kind that we usually told don't deserve a happy ending, the kind that don't deserve love, the kind that are destined to die, because apparently to survive in a patriarchal society a woman must be loved, and to be loved she must be agreeable, sweet, kind and gentle, and be a good girl, and do what she's told. So then why has the villainess become everyone's new role model? Why is the female equivalent of a genre that is supposed to be just a pleasurable escapist fantasy is sometimes so disturbingly dark and sad? Why do we side with these villainesses? And why do we want to escape into being them? Well, to answer that question, we'll have to unpack what Isekai even is, and the kind of good life fantasy it presents. But also we'll have to explore our own assumptions about female goodness and badness, how bad girls are typically portrayed in popular culture, and most importantly, how we've been taught to respond to them. Because as we'll see, villainesses and bad girls are also met with a lot of pushback, because they don't behave the way women are expected to behave. Chapter 1. Cruel Optimism. The villainess as protagonist is a major trope in a genre the English-speaking fandom calls otome isekai, a term supposedly derived from the Japanese words otome meaning maiden and isekai meaning another world. And naturally no one actually uses this term in Japan or Korea, where these stories are simply referred to as romance fantasy. And isekai itself is a genre that has exploded in popularity, taking over the light novel, manga and anime industries in Japan. And while some people are getting tired of it, others can't seem to get enough. And if I were to explain the key features of isekai, for those of you who are fortunate enough to have avoided it so far, it would go something like this. Typically, there is a male protagonist, usually an ordinary guy, often a high schooler, who gets transferred, summoned, or reincarnated into another world, which is almost always modeled after fantasy Europe. Isekai stories are often seen as escapist power fantasies for the disenchanted youth, which explains why the typical isekai protagonist is usually unhappy and unsuccessful in their real-life situation. They also often incorporate various game elements that make the fantasy world more orderly and rational, unlike the chaotic mess of reality. The protagonist who was completely ordinary back home, or worse, was someone who somehow failed at life, someone who was wasting his life away without a sense of purpose. This protagonist finds himself in a new world and usually discovers that he now has some sort of special talent or ability. This ability often seems bizarre, maybe even useless at first. But to no one's surprise, it usually turns out to be incredibly powerful, and of course, the key to saving the world. So our very average guy suddenly becomes secretly OP, and now he can finally discover the full limits of his potential. Someone who's always been told he's a useless nothing, now finally has a chance at becoming something. He's given a chance to achieve greatness through self-improvement, and that self-improvement really has no boundaries. Because, that's just what life is. You get born, you improve yourself, and then you die. Along the way, our protagonist often assembles a harem of girls, or at the very least, a tight-knit circle of friends, plus tons of money. So he basically acquires all the things a truly respectable man is supposed to have in a patriarchal society. Things that he, of course, didn't have, or some would argue, couldn't have in his previous life. Isekai stories could be a new spin on the kinds of narratives that are usually marketed towards men. Stories of adventure, power and glory, stories where the main goal of the protagonist is to become stronger and stronger, usually by fighting different opponents and enemies. These action-adventure stories feature a protagonist who starts off as weak and disadvantaged, but is destined to overcome extreme challenges. Eventually, he acquires immense power that most of us can only dream of in reality. Once he becomes strong, all of his and the world's problems tend to get resolved. The nature of such power often goes unquestioned, as we are expected to just accept that the strong will always dominate the weak unless the weak manage to become strong themselves. In Isekai, however, the traditional ideal of power that men are told they are supposed to achieve is redefined to mean something more than physical strength or fighting abilities. In Isekai, every ability or talent becomes a form of power, even if it initially seems useless or uncool, like only being able to wield a shield, or I don't know, if you're reborn as a mere bird, or even a slime. Basically, even if you don't conform to the traditional idea of strength, if you are not physically imposing or have no interest in spending all your free time training your body, you can still become strong and save the world. You just need to tap into your unique talent. But this narrative still doesn't question the idea that you have to become powerful for your life to have meaning, and for others to respect you. It just says that you too, my friend, can rise to the top of the food chain. You can become strong if you work hard enough and figure out your unique abilities. That's how masculinity under patriarchy is supposed to be performed. Men are told that they need to achieve greatness. They are put under extreme pressure to compete with each other. They are also told to be happy about it. After all, they say there is nothing worse or more humiliating than being weak and powerless, right? Female-oriented isekai, on the other hand, takes a somewhat different approach. In male-oriented isekai, the protagonist is given the second chance to become successful and powerful by discovering his unique talents because that's what's expected of him if he wants to be seen as a real man. Traditional masculinity demands that he become strong, even if those old ideas of strength don't necessarily fit within contemporary society anymore. But what do traditional gender roles expect of women? It's not to become strong, it's to be enduring. In both Korea and Japan, traditional ideals of femininity were heavily influenced by Confucianism, which emphasized that women should be subordinate to their husbands and prioritize their family's well-being over personal ambitions and dreams. While that ideal evolved somewhat over the course of the 20th century thanks to the introduction of women's education and more women engaging in the arts, teaching, and enlightenment, a distinct heroine archetype persisted, especially in shoujo manga and sunjang manhwa. This heroine is kind, resilient, and gentle. She is expected to endure hardships while remaining warm-hearted and virtuous. Her story reinforces the idea that goodness and perseverance will eventually lead to happiness and success. She is highly empathetic and understanding, always putting others' feelings before her own. By being naturally kind, self-sacrificing, and working tirelessly for the sake of others, she will, of course, earn their love and respect. If the hero achieves success, earns love and respect by becoming strong, the heroine does the same thing by being enduring and staying kind, even though she's considered weak. These ideas of the heroine's success stories aren't just limited to Japan or Korea. They're found in stories all over the world. This type of heroine is a staple in romance novels, often portrayed as an all-forgiving angel who saves the dark, dangerous hero with her love. You'll also find her in fairy tales. Early Disney princesses are the very embodiment of this archetype. Essentially, under patriarchy, women are given one viable success strategy: to be a good girl. And not just a good girl, but a very, very good girl. One who must suppress all of her desires and ambitions for the sake of others. By being good, the heroine earns the ultimate reward, a good patriarch, a knight in shining armor, who will come, sweep her off her feet, and magically make all of her troubles and unfairness of her life disappear. But both the strong man and the good girl strategies are actually pretty unfair. Not just unfair, they're cruel, because the happy endings that they promise aren't easily or even realistically achievable in real life. Yet, despite knowing that reality doesn't operate like a fantasy, we remain attached to this idea of a good life that always seems just within reach, of happiness that can be achieved if we become successful or stay good no matter what. It's what Lauren Berlant called cruel optimism in their book of the same name. It's the condition of maintaining an attachment to a significantly problematic object. Cruel optimism is an incitement to inhabit and to track the effective attachment to what we call the good life, which is for so many a bad life that wears out the subjects who nonetheless, and at the same time, find their conditions of possibility within it. Or, in other words, it's when we are attached to the very ideas that actually make us suffer, like the idea that we must be rich and successful to be loved, or that we must be good girls for life to reward us. We are optimistic that we can reach the promised happiness because we feel like we're in proximity of it. Here it is, we just gotta be patient and try a little bit harder, and we'll have it all, promise. Berlant calls it technologies of patience that enable the concept of the later to suspend questions about the cruelty of the now. Basically, it's the idea that the problems of the present can be solved with hope and optimism, which is why it's absolutely fine if you are suffering right now because you are free to hope for the better. But this video is about villainesses and female-oriented isekai, I promise. So let's revisit our story trope. Our female protagonist dies and gets reborn into a story, a fairy tale of sorts, that already has its good girl heroine, the kind and empathetic one, destined to win the love of the hero or heroes with her goodness and beauty. But of course, our protagonist isn't reborn as the heroine. She's reborn as the side character, or worse, the villainess. So why do you think that is? Well, maybe it's because being a good girl is exhausting. Isekai are literal escape fantasies, and imagine escaping into a fantasy world only to be stuck as a good girl for the rest of your life. Would you be able to keep up with that kind of standard? Because I wouldn't. Especially in a world where a woman's literal survival depends on being obedient, good, and doing what she's told. The villainess, on the other hand, isn't expected to be good. Unlike the good girl heroine, the villainess is free. Free to be flawed, selfish, and to put herself first. She is free to be human, not an angel. All those Japanese stories that start with a literal Prince Charming publicly breaking off his engagement with the protagonist, declaring her the wicked scheming villainess and choosing the perfect heroine instead, that's actually the moment the protagonist becomes truly free, not just from the prince but from society's expectations of becoming someone's possession. After all, villainesses aren't marriage material. No one believes in their goodness anyway, so they are liberated from the need to play the good girl role. The protagonist, who is reincarnated as a villainess, is also finally free from being the good girl that she had to be in her previous life. For example, Do-hee from The Perks of Being a Villainess lived her whole life as a doormat, a pushover, a very good girl who for some reason didn't get the love and respect good girls get in fairy tales. It could be because the fictional good girl princesses are often either breathtakingly beautiful to begin with, or are eventually made to sparkle one way or another. But in real life, beauty in its conventional sense is something that us, mere humans, real-life good girls in training, don't always get to have. So Do-hee doesn't get rewarded for her goodness, instead she just dies miserably, to be reborn as Deborah, the villainess, which literally gives her permission to stop being a doormat, because now she has to play her role. She also now gets to be filthy rich and, oh wow, breathtakingly beautiful as a generous fantasy bonus. So basically, the role of the villainess is free from the cruel optimism of the good girl fantasy. The fantasy that tells us that we will achieve our own happiness only if we put other people's interests before our own, because then they will love us for our kindness. The fantasy that is sometimes the very cause of our suffering, because we are so attached to it that we suppress our own needs and desires in promise of a supposedly beautiful future. Sometimes sacrificing yourself for the sake of others only leads to your own misery. And the Villainess Isekai subtly subverts the idea that women have to be good and selfless to survive. Villainous stories question whether we actually need to put up with society's bullshit if we want to become happy. They question whether it's healthy for an individual to be well-adjusted to a sick society in the first place. These stories explore what happens when women refuse to be good girls. Maybe good girls go to heaven and bad girls go wherever they want. Chapter 2. Bad Girls. Or maybe not. Maybe bad girls just die pathetic, horrible deaths of villainesses. Villainous Isekai are meta-stories. They are built upon a common, universally recognizable narrative where the good girls win and the bad girls get what they deserve or die. They are built upon a narrative that says that bad girls don't deserve love or a happy ending. Unfortunately, there's usually a problem with bad girls in popular culture. The problem is that many people find them unlikable, unless certain conditions are met. This might be one of the reasons why even in female-oriented media, it's usually male characters that serve as an outlet for readers' aggression and anger. It's safe for female readers to identify with bad boy characters, as doing so doesn't violate any gender norms, because women are expected to be good, kind, gentle, and of course, pure. In fact, some people still argue that women are naturally kinder, gentler, and more upright than men are. They claim that women, as nurturers and child-rearers, must carry the burden of seeing to society's moral needs and guiding others to the light. A Victorian writer in an 1894 editorial even claimed that it is wickeder for women to be moral than it is for men, because women are by nature more moral than their brothers. Under this belief, a woman's badness is seen as unnatural, a sign of her malfunctioning. It is almost expected that men will misbehave. Frowned upon, of course, but hardly surprising. But a woman being wicked? That's just her being bad at being a woman. But even failing to perform femininity correctly has to fit into some sort of gender-appropriate mold. This is why in popular culture, villainesses often possess stereotypically negative feminine traits. Anything that falls beyond good, nurturing, and pure. Wicked women are usually hypersexual, mentally unstable, or simply jealous of the beautiful angelic heroine. According to a survey conducted by Deborah Bradley, 28% of Disney villainesses are driven by jealousy or vanity, and 27% by inherent evil. By contrast, only 4% of male villains are driven by jealousy or vanity, and only 8% by inherent evil. Instead, most male villains, surprise surprise, are driven by wealth, 38%, and power, 33%, the expected ambitions of patriarchal masculinity. Villainesses are also often portrayed as unattractive and undesirable to men. Sometimes this is because they are no longer young, and therefore no longer beautiful, and sometimes because they appear subtly masculine in their features, body shapes, and behaviors. And as Sarah Gailey knows, villainesses often represent what is forbidden to women. As they put it, we look at female cartoon villains and we see what's forbidden. Ferocity. Never laugh with your head thrown back. Never apply your eyeshadow at a cut crease. Never draw in your brows or dye your hair. Don't wear nice clothes, unless they've been sewn for you by people or animals who love you or delivered to you by magic. Don't look in mirrors. Don't want things. Don't get old or fat or tall. Don't make demands. Hope maybe, but never expect. No, not even if you dedicated your life to a goal, even then. Don't you dare expect. Historically, whenever we got a female character who was independent and strong-willed, she was almost always paired with serious moral flaws. We couldn't just have a woman running a business without making her vain and cruel, like Cruella de Vil, plotting to turn cute little puppies into a fur coat. Then we have anti-heroines. Unlike villainesses, anti-heroines are morally flawed but still possess some redeeming qualities, which makes us, as readers and viewers, root for them. Anti-heroines seem to have broken free from the good girl mold. They get to be ferocious, ruthless, and even cruel. As Eleonora Sereny argues, in some genres, like superhero narratives, anti-heroines are often reformed villainesses, made into a more amenable version of femininity. Take Harley Quinn, for example. Originally, she was a female villain sidekick, hopelessly in love with the Joker, and helping him, often unsuccessfully, with his nefarious schemes. But in more recent adaptations, she's been reimagined as an unstable, justice-seeking anti-heroine. She's still violent and ruthless, sometimes excessively so, but she's now positioned as more sympathetic, more likeable. So, how do you turn a villainess into an anti-heroine? What are her redeeming qualities that justify her moral flaws? How do you make a bad girl likeable? Well, according to Adriana Clay-Velasquez, you make a bad girl likeable by exploiting the same old gender norms. For example, she might be a mother who resorts to cruel methods to save her child, or a dangerous, sexy seductress who turns grown men into trembling little boys with the bat of her lashes. Or perhaps she is a survivor of sexual violence, willing to do whatever it takes to punish her abuser and ensure he never hurts anyone else again. Essentially, the audience is often only able to find a bad girl likable if she fits neatly into traditional roles, as a carer, a victim, or an erotic object. These roles are her redeeming qualities. She must still align with the gender expectations ascribed to her. So one of the ways to make a villainess into a reformed and more likable anti-heroine, like Harley Quinn, is to make her a victim of male violence. Eleonora Sereny argues that if the original Harley Quinn was just a weirdo with her obsessive romantic attachment to the Joker, in the 2016 Rebirth series, the narrative turns her into another unwilling female victim of mental and physical abuse at the Joker's hands, alongside other women in the genre. You might think that this isn't surprising. You might say that, of course, we need some redeeming qualities or trauma to empathize with morally flawed characters. And yes, some people outright dislike engaging with morally ambiguous characters altogether, disapproving of villains being humanized. But there are also cases where the opposite happens. Characters who are written to make us root for them, even though their moral flaws are grievous and they possess no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Think of Tony Soprano, Hannibal Lecter, or Alex from A Clockwork Orange. These characters are what A.W. Eaton calls rough heroes. Characters whose moral flaws are grievous and are an integral part of their personality, who fully intend to do bad and are remorseless about their crimes, and whose vices are not outweighed by some redeeming virtues. And most importantly, characters who the audience is not meant to forgive, but we still root for them. When we encounter rough heroes in fiction, we are presented with a certain moral conundrum. We know these characters are monsters, and yet we cheer them on. We start to question our own moral compass. Why do I want Tony Soprano to evade the police? I know he's a horrible person, so why can't I bring myself to hope for his demise? What is wrong with me? Eaton argues that this internal conflict is what makes these characters so enjoyable. It's an aesthetic achievement by the writers, because it's incredibly difficult to write a fully moral character and still get the audience to root for them. And you know what's even more difficult? It's to write a female character who is equally immoral, whose actions are unforgivable, and still make the audience root for her. According to Clava Vasquez, there are many examples of rough heroes in fiction, but far fewer examples of rough heroines. The few that come to mind might be Amy Dunn from Gone Girl or Shiv Roy from Succession. We like them, we root for them, even though they're clearly immoral. But rough heroines are much harder to pull off because of the deeply ingrained idea that women are naturally more moral and virtuous than men. Women who are immoral and have no excuses for their actions come across as unnatural abominations. They are monsters. Monsters who are wickeder than men. Amy Dunn is an excellent example. In the Gone Girl novel, she is incredibly likable despite being a total monster, but many people noticed that in the movie adaptation she was positioned as an antagonist. On screen she becomes a ruthless villain, so hated that the audience wants to see her defeated. Similarly, Shiv Roy has a huge fanbase, but articles often pop up reminding us, hey, by the way, she was immoral, don't forget. But why do you guys like her, these articles ask? She does bad things. Not only are there fewer rough heroines, the audience seems to experience a lot more resistance when trying to ally with them. Clavel Vasquez argues that this resistance, the discomfort we feel around rough heroines, is because they violate gender norms, and this violation makes us uneasy. It's almost as if we expect men to be morally transgressive. Well, maybe expect isn't the right word, but at least we're not surprised by it. Characters like Tony Soprano and Hannibal Lecter align with our expectations of masculinity. But Amy Dunn? She's unsettling. Women aren't supposed to be like that. Aren't we supposed to be nicer than men? Well, we're not. But we still seem to be learning that, which might be why even the villainous protagonists in Isekai, more often than not, don't transgress moral norms. They are not necessarily bad girls, they are just regular girls, or well, maybe more assertive good girls, or good girls 2.0. Remember, their goal is to survive, to escape the ugly fate of the villainess. So they often choose not to, do the dumb, evil stuff that the villainesses in their original stories do. Take Katerina from My Next Life as a Villainess. She's the definition of a good girl, yet she doesn't hesitate to break down a character's door with an axe to save him. Or look at Rishi from Seventh Loop, who boldly decides to follow her own desires and aspirations. Then there's Judith from The Villainess Flips the Script, who chooses to confront others head-on, doing whatever it takes to protect her nephew. These villainesses are moral and kind, yet unapologetic in their strength and boldness. These are the more light-hearted and comedic villainous stories, where the protagonist is still nice, but less angelic and more assertive. But then there are also darker villainous stories that feel almost sad. These stories depict environments so hostile to the protagonists that being a good girl just doesn't work. For example, the protagonist from Villains Are Destined to Die finds herself stuck in a game where she must secure the affection of male characters or die. The problem is that she's cast as the villainess, Penelope, who everyone already hates, making death feel like her only possible fate. As Penelope, she quickly realizes that no amount of kindness or good girl behavior will win over these characters because they are stuck in their own trauma loops, automatically viewing her as evil and misinterpreting her every move. None of them even bothers to listen to her. Desperate to survive and escape the death game, Penelope makes some morally questionable choices. She calculates which male character would be the easiest to manipulate for affection, and sets her sights on Eccles, a slave, reasoning that if she's kind to him and buys him gifts, he'll fall in love with her. But the expected behavior of a morally upright female protagonist would be, of course, to care for Eccles and the injustice of his life situation. And yeah, her behavior doesn't sit well with everyone. Penelope doesn't buy Eccles to save him from slavery, although she eventually offers him freedom. She is motivated by her own self-interest. Penelope isn't a good girl, and that's what makes her both loved and hated. She makes questionable decisions and doesn't feel remorse. And she doesn't have a convenient excuse either. She could be kinder, but she chooses not to be. Maybe we expect Penelope to automatically empathize with Eccles' misery instead of putting her own interests first. We expect her to not care that he's a grown man who's very much capable of hurting her. We expect her to show him kindness and pacify him if needed. We expect her to be gentle and nurturing. But we wouldn't expect the same thing from a male character. I think the resistance some people feel towards characters like Penelope is the reason why we don't see too many true villainesses in Isekai stories. Most are assertive good girls 2.0. But there are exceptions, like Penelope, Roxana, Artesia from The Villainess Lives Again, or Emilia from Akuya Kureiji no Naka no Hito. These exceptions are still very popular despite occasional pushback. That pushback, though, is understandable. After centuries of reading about virtuous female protagonists, it's jarring to engage with morally grey women who are not victims. Even I sometimes feel that resistance, despite experiencing none when dealing with the moral male characters. It's a sign of just how deep sexism runs, clever and deeply embedded in our reaction to stories. Chapter 3: Conflict and Compassion. But there's also another way of incorporating morally flawed female characters into stories, by casting them as side characters rather than protagonists. When bad girls take the spotlight, audiences often resist, but if they linger at the edges of the story, that resistance seems to soften. A common question in Reborn as the Villainess stories is, what happens to the original villainess when the protagonist reincarnates and takes her place? And the answer is often heartbreaking. She disappears. Some villainesses abandon the world, unable to endure the injustice and pressure society places on them. Others are left to die, forsaken and forgotten by their own families, as if their will to fight was entirely extinguished. These are fantasy worlds, but they reflect a very real truth. Patriarchal societies punish women who aren't agreeable, who don't conform. The good girl strategy might be cruel in its optimism, but the grim fate of bad girls is far crueler. This is what makes villainous stories both a critique of patriarchy and a form of coping. As products of popular culture, these stories articulate a problem, rigid gender roles and societal resistance to selfish, flawed women, and offer a fantasy solution. The reincarnation or regression of the protagonist is that fantasy solution, and it serves as a satisfying outlet for our anxieties around these issues. It creates a space where a flawed, angry, or traumatized girl can escape the punishment usually reserved for women like her, or at least be avenged by the protagonist. This narrative offers us a version of a happy ending for women society would typically abandon. The clever part is how these stories manage to engage with female badness without triggering the audience's ingrained resistance. As we've just discussed, we are conditioned to reject morally flawed female characters because of the belief that women are supposed to embody the moral compass of humanity. These stories sidestep that resistance by not asking the audience to identify directly with the original villainess. They ask us to replace her instead. Because usually there is a notable difference between the villainess who is doomed and destined to die, and the protagonist who comes to escape that fate in her place. And even with that distance, these stories offer compassion and understanding for the original villainess. We may denounce her immoral actions, but we still empathize with her pain and frustration, knowing full well that it's an unjust society and often abusive families that shaped her into the villainess she became. These original villainesses usually aren't even actual criminals. They aren't even incarnate. They're young, traumatized girls who realize they can't win love or approval through goodness, patience, or self-sacrifice. In many cases, they come to understand that they can't win their family's love no matter what they do, because they are treated as tools to be used and traded away for family interests. They are old enough to grasp the unfairness of their position in society, but usually too young and inexperienced to see the bigger picture, unaware that their struggles, though painful, are not necessarily the most unjust in worlds where the rich exploit the poor. They are angry, but they don't know how to deal with that anger. After all, women aren't taught how to handle aggression. We are told that we are naturally kind and gentle, that we are not supposed to feel anger or express it. So these young villainesses lash out, but in their frustration they direct their anger at the wrong targets, hurting those who haven't actually wronged them. In societies that don't tolerate women who lash out, they are inevitably brought to justice, often in the most cruel and tragic ways. They die without ever having their grievances addressed or resolved. Then the narrative rewinds. We travel back in time before the villainess has committed any actual crimes. Here we either witness the original villainess regress or see someone else take her place. This new villainess is different. She's more mature, more level-headed, and she has a bit more emotional distance from the original trauma. She understands the unfairness but can approach it with more clarity and strategy. She isn't exactly a good girl. Her actions are often motivated by self-interest, but she doesn't lash out blindly. She operates with purpose. The new villainess often embodies the role of a level-headed older sister, the one who understands the original villainess's pain but won't let that pain dictate her actions. She finds ways to protect herself, carve out her independence, and even graciously rescue the local Duke of the North, and maybe save the world while she's at it. All this without being purely good or purely evil. She stays moral enough to navigate her world, though she makes exceptions when necessary. She's still willing to bend the rules, but no longer lashes out like a wounded animal. In her hands, justice becomes a matter of strategy, not rage. Or rather, this way, villainous stories become a fantasy solution to female rage, because the new villainess is able to kick everyone's asses without actually raging. She stays cool, the rage happened in another timeline and was punished by death. And the current timeline usually only has badass solutions and none of the hurt. In Korean stories especially, the protagonist is usually in her late 20s before she dies and reincarnates as the villainess, and the villainess is usually in her teens. These stories invite us to fantasize about what it would be like if we could relive our younger years with the emotional maturity needed to handle the pressures society puts on us and the traumas inflicted by our families. What could our youth look like if we weren't miserable, if we were strong and resilient enough to handle it all? It's a nice fantasy, but also a sad one, because in reality, youth is often marked by inexperience and immaturity, which is why everyone is miserable all the time. We watch Arya in The Villainess Turns the Hourglass relive her teenage years, getting it right this time by being wise and strategic about surviving in a hostile family. We see Bianca in Marriage of Convenience go back to the early years of her marriage and make it work, but her situation remains awful. She was, after all, basically sold off by her father at the age of 9 to a much older man. Bianca and Arya only survive because they get a second chance. Their older, wiser selves know how to avoid the mistakes of their youth, but it's no surprise those mistakes were made in the first place. The sad truth is that women like Arya and Bianca usually don't get happy endings. So it's no surprise that villainous stories are wildly popular. This trope keeps getting reproduced with countless variations and nuances from one story to another. The more we rethink traditional gender roles, the more rigid the good girl narrative seems to us. These stories promote new notions of femininity that emphasize independence and allow more social, intellectual, and sexual freedom, and position that modern femininity against traditional representations. We see a new kind of female protagonist, one who isn't just good or evil, but strong, independent, and possessing a healthy level of selfishness. What's interesting is how this new protagonist, the villainess, is often positioned in direct opposition to the character who represents those more traditional notions of femininity, the heroine, who offers a different take on the good girl. The heroine presents herself as virtuous, but this often turns out to be more of a survival tactic. Many times she is revealed to be self-serving and manipulative, pretending to be kind and passive while working towards her own ends. Some people view this reframing of the good girl as negative, as a form of internalized sexism, and I don't entirely disagree. There are definitely some not like other girls vibes here. But I also don't think that internalized sexism is the full picture here. Not all conflicts between women can be attributed to it. We are human after all, capable of clashing over opinions, values, and approaches to life. In fact, the conflict between villainesses and heroines isn't simply about contrasting models of femininity or what women should be. It's more a conflict between authenticity and conformity. Should we live authentically, true to ourselves, or should we conform to societal expectations? In many of these stories, the heroine often hides her authentic self, presenting an image that aligns with what society expects. The villainess, however, chooses authenticity, even if it displeases those around her. Neither approach is inherently right or wrong, but it's no surprise they come into conflict. So it is tempting to see this reframing of the good girl character as a result of internalized sexism, where the villainess becomes a not like other girls girl character. But the villainess's popularity points out to something deeper, a shift in our understanding of femininity as inherently virtuous. We see ourselves in these villainesses because perhaps we are finally acknowledging how exhausting it is to be enduring, empathetic, and understanding 100% of the time. We can no longer live up to the impossible standards that the good girl represents. Our ideals of femininity are evolving, and the conflict between the villainess and the heroine is one of the battlegrounds where these ideals clash. In that sense, this conflict can be not only cathartic, but also constructive. In fact, I think we need more stories about bad women, and women who are even bad to each other. We're told that unlike men, we're not supposed to be violent and aggressive, but many women report feeling constant anger without knowing how to express it. Aggression is often seen as something only men naturally have, something that they do sometimes to women, although mostly at each other in order to get something they want. In fact, ideas about women's supposed innate non-aggressiveness have been used in the past as an argument about why women shouldn't vote, since women are physically incapable of carrying into execution any law they might enact, and can't effectively back up their votes by force. William Gladstone, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1868 to 1894, argued that voting would trespass upon women's delicacy, their purity, their refinement, the elevation of their whole nature. Which is why we need true villainesses and bad girls, not just as models for expressing our own anger and frustration and to validate those feelings, but also because aggression can be a form of agency, a way of daring to pursue what we want. As Gillian Flynn puts it, I think women like to read about murderous mothers and lost little girls because it's our only mainstream outlet to even begin discussing female violence on a personal level. Female violence is a specific brand of ferocity. It's invasive. A girl fight is all teeth and hair, spit and nails, a much more fearsome thing to watch than two dudes clobbering each other. And the mental violence is positively gory. Women entwine. Some of the most disturbing, sick relationships I've witnessed are between longtime friends and especially mothers and daughters. Innuendo, backspin, false encouragement, punishing withdrawal, sexual jealousy, garden variety jealousy. Watching women go to work on each other is a horrific bit of pageantry that can stretch on for years. So I don't see anything inherently wrong with the conflict between the villainess and the heroine, or with depicting female ferocity. This tension lets us explore what it actually means to be a woman, not an angel. Villainous Isekai stories offer a delicate balance. They allow morally flawed women to exist, but add enough distance and narrative framing to avoid triggering too much resistance from the audience. They give us flawed heroines without demanding that we overlook or forgive all of their faults, creating a space to reimagine what it means to be imperfect yet deserving of a happy ending. These stories reframe femininity and explore questions of female power and agency. Interestingly, I think they also reframe masculinity alongside it, but that might be a topic for another video. The immense popularity of villainous isekai stories signals a shift in the types of protagonists female audiences want to see. And by female audiences, I mean not only those in Korea and Japan, but also us, international readers, because these stories have become global. They are translated, fan-translated, and loved across many different languages and cultures. Of course, villainous stories are not without their flaws. As products of popular culture, they inevitably reproduce the ideologies of those who create and consume them. That's precisely why they resonate so widely. So while these stories creatively imagine a shift in traditional gender roles, they often take certain ideas, such as capitalism and imperialism, at face value. Isn't it strange that even in our escapist fantasies we dream of being born fabulously wealthy and beautiful in a world-dominating empire, instead of envisioning equality for all people and nations? Why is that even in fiction such a wild idea remains beyond our imagination? It's a reminder to stay critical of the things we enjoy and avoid taking them at face value. In stories, the devil is often in the details, or more precisely, in the background, lurking in the elements that go unexamined, built upon assumptions so basic no one even thinks to question them. But on the other hand, we should also celebrate what we love and pay attention to why we love it. Stories like this reveal so much about our evolving cultures. And some changes, such as the loosening of rigid gender roles, the questioning of the good girl narrative, and the imagining of happy endings for bad girls, to me, are undeniably positive. Thank you for listening.